As you guys know, we have the AAME job board, jobs.aame.org. It is absolutely free to post any of your senior executive level recruitments. It's free for recruiters, it's free for cities themselves. However, if you would like to have those jobs included in my newsletter, which goes out to 10,000 subscribers every week on LinkedIn, especially if you're trying to reach those passive candidates, right? Those prized passive candidates that aren't actively looking but are reading my newsletter for news and information about what's going on in the profession, you can put those listings in the newsletter for $199. There is a link on the AAME job board, the pricing page. Just click that, and you will see the $199 posting in order to get those listings in the weekly newsletter. All right, all right, all right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. And with me today is Sam Toles for part 2 of my interview series with him. Today, we are talking about social media in general. In the first episode, we talked about essentially why you should be on social media if you are a local government, if you are a local government executive. And in this episode, we're going to unpack a couple remnant points from that discussion related to his new book called The Social Media Playbook for City and County Managers. And then we're also going to unpack a project that we're excited to announce regarding social media and how we can help you as a city manager educate your elected officials to help make your job and the job of your staff easier. Because we all know that elected officials can get spun up, right? They can get put into a tizzy when they see a couple of STPs, keyboard warriors, pounding away on the Facebook comments, and they get all up spun up in a tizzy and they create more work for you. So we have some ideas on how we can mitigate that. So Sam, I wanted to circle back to our discussion from part 1. I had a couple remnant points I wanted to make. We'd run out of time in that first episode. The first thing I wanted to bring up was in the book, you have a discussion about PIOs and social media managers, and I have a little bit of a quibble with you. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to pretend I agree with everything you or any of my guests say. I have my strong opinions on matters. And in your book, you talk about the PIOs versus social media managers. And in this context, the PIOs are these traditional sort of public information officers, oftentimes with a journalistic background, former reporters and what have you, who get hired on the local government agencies. And the social media managers tend to be, the newer, younger upstarts who come from a completely different background, who are not formally trained in journalism and what have you. And in your book, you talk about how it's important for PIOs to understand that social media managers are their equals when it comes to the city manager kind of communicating these social media directives through the organization. And I guess I want to take I want to sort of pick that apart a little bit, because I think, going back to the first discussion where I talked about the importance of social media and how people are getting their information, that in fact social media managers are more important than PIOs. And I think city managers need to be more cognizant of this distinction when they're looking at evaluating their social media program and who they're putting in place to oversee it.
Yeah, no, look, I have a lot of feelings on this. A great social media manager is one of the most invaluable tools local government can find. And it's a lot harder to find that person in this competitive marketplace than it is to find a traditional PIO. Why? Because one media business is declining and one is accelerating, right? So, where I think the balance is important, and where I look, the PIOs I've worked with, some of them, like Sarah over in Plainville, Connecticut, rock star. I mean, just total rock star.
She gets it,
She,
right?
no, she impressed the heck out of me because she'd first and foremost done a deep dive on my LinkedIn and was asking me like, so tell me about Rambo. Now, Rambo is a Twitch creator that I worked with, very very specific to the gaming sector, and like tell me about Tubbo and tell me about AAME. She knew all the creators, not because I say on my LinkedIn like I worked with these people, but she knew the organization that I was leading, and she knew that those creators were affiliated with that organization. So she'd connected the dots, and so what that told me is, wow, she is deep in the ecosystem of social media. And as we work together, one of the things that I always find fun and challenging and interesting when I work with someone like Sarah is she's going to teach me as much as I'm going to teach her. And that was the way it worked at Bleacher Report. Like I would just absorb information from these kids who are native to TikTok, who are native to Instagram. Like they are so valuable. And so when I look at someone like Sarah, what I'm trying to do is create structure, like a framework around, okay, when you're thinking about posting, how much of sort of the fun, more social native content that you're going to be drawn to versus how much more of the informational sort of meat and potatoes. I think about like for local governments, the social media strategy is about like creating a full course meal. There's the appetizer, there's the dessert, but you got to have that meat and potatoes in the middle, communicating, the purpose of the organization, the things that matter to the community. You're also communicating to different demographics from boomers to Gen A. Like there's a you what I find with social media managers is sometimes they're really, 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 really good at one thing, but they need the context of the other. And what PIOs are good at is they're really, really good at understanding like the boomers and some of the older Gen X and silence. But as far as millennials, Gen Z, and why don't we talk about millennials? Like millennials are going to be, I think there are many millennials in their early 40s now. We're not talking about, the
20-year-olds.
millennials that are 20. Like everybody's like, oh, Facebook is our primary platform. I actually do an overlay whenever I meet with a city. Like if you're going to take a meeting with me and we're going to talk about your social media needs, I go into demographics and I look at your median age. Most cities fall somewhere between like 35 and 43. That's, some age in between that. And then I just put down like the social media platforms, because in the way the survey data works, like you see each age cohort and they're like little bars. It's a bar graph. And I'm like, this is where Instagram is. And what's interesting is Instagram is always like right at the core. Like the core of the people that are in your community are Instagram users. Like that is their core platform. And then they go, well, we're on Facebook or we're on Instagram, but we're using Facebook to cross post. And so that social media manager who has that native understanding of Instagram is wildly valuable. But that doesn't mean that that PIO who is, has been protecting the city, who knows how to deal with local reporters, who knows how to deal with traditional media, which in larger organizations or more metro areas, like local media still is a thing. Having them there is still valuable. You could definitely make the argument that, if we're looking at it just statistically, that social media manager is probably going to reach more people and is going to be more valuable to the organization. But the maturity and the natural thing that a really good PIO has is structure and thoughtfulness. And then they can pull young members of the staff who are more socially native, your police officer, your, young firefighter, your lifeguard, and have them creating content and program it strategically. So I've seen it work both ways. Most organizations have one or the other, but I'm not going to say that your perspective is entirely wrong. Where I will make a big, again, asterisk, underline, bold, and you said this at the end of your last episode, so I think it's really worth taking a pause here. A lot of city managers really trust their department heads, right? It's ingrained. When I ran Bleacher Report or MGM, I absolutely trusted my department heads and wanted to empower them, especially when I was considering doing something that was very fundamental to their area. A lot of traditional PIOs will take an inbound of like, hey, we're thinking about bringing on Sam Toles to do this thing as a first and foremost is like, am I not doing my job correctly? And
Like an indictment on their
right, an
performance,
indictment
right?
on their performance. This is not an indictment on their performance, right? My being is to help give them tools to modernize an approach because they've never been given those tools. They've never been exposed to modern social media. They don't have the knowledge. And so I'm not there for more than, a few days. So it's not like I'm looking to take their job. I'm literally there to empower them. But I just want your, manager audience to understand, especially in this communication space, people who are involved in communications tend to be creative, and creatives are really reflexive of another creative or another voice in the room. It's just a natural thing. And so they will be resistant to this, especially the more traditional they are.
But I also think that that's a key point because I think a lot of PIOs tend to lack some of that creativity because they come from a more regimented journalistic background, and you lose
Yes.
that spontaneity, you lose
Yep.
that creativity, you lose that ability to take some risk, follow the trends and what have you. And I think, you got to be very careful. So if you were a city manager and you have a traditional PIO, I would be very cognizant of that and make sure I'm aware of what the strengths and limitations are of that personality, typical person in a PIO position. And you go through that and extensively in your book, which, as you said in part one, if you are a listener of the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, you can get a free copy. He's going to give you a free copy of his book. You don't even have to go to Amazon and buy it. I will have that link and information in the show notes. But he gives a very good dissection of the pros and cons of a PIO and the social media manager. They both have their strengths, they both have their weaknesses. I would posit that if you are a mid-sized and smaller organization, it's far more important for you to have a social media manager than a PIO. And I'll leave it at that. So Sam, you were going on a little bit about department heads, and I thought you were going to go a little bit of a different direction, but I want to follow up with that because in your book you have a very strong view, I believe, when it comes to social media management and splitting up the social media pages between the different departments in the organization. And in your book, you practice, or you believe that most organizations should just have one primary social media account, that there should not be separate accounts for different departments. Is that a fair characterization of your viewpoint?
Yeah, look, I think this comes from the fact that when you have, and I see it a lot in many of the clients I work with, like I was recently with a city that had 24 different Facebook accounts for a
Are you
city that has,
serious?
yeah, the city that had
24?
24. Each firehouse had its, well, that's a different one. One city had a number of Facebook accounts, and each firehouse had their own Facebook account, like the individual house of the, like not just the fire department, but each
Wow.
individual. So what happens, and this is natural. This is, again, none of what I do is an indictment of where you guys have been, right? Like I don't come in and say, God darn it, you guys have. There's no roadmap, until I came along. There's a lot of firms, and I won't badmouth any. I certainly have. You've got your Baker Tilly's. I got my list. I got my list. I do. And
I want to know that list. This is
oh,
unfiltered. Are you going to be filtered today, Sam? Or are you going to go unfiltered?
oh man, I'll hint at it a little bit and play with our friend Scott Trujillo over in Calabasas in a second. But there's a huge benefit, from an audience perspective. You want to have the largest group of people following you, seeing the information, seeing that the city as an operation is not just its public safety, it's not just its library, it's not just its parks, it's not just its summer staff around the pool or the water park. Like it's a living, breathing thing that's taking care of everybody. And so what happens when you have department-based social media is some departments will be very active and doing a lot of things. So you're seeing a ton of stuff from, let's say, the library, because libraries are awesome, and they tend to have really good people who have a better grasp of social media. Why? Because libraries, like traditional media, have had to reinvent themselves. They've had to add services like, renting a video game system, or, even renting a KitchenAid, right? Like giving people opportunities to find value in a place that time and technology has challenged. So they're like, how do we get young people to come to the library? And they come up with very clever ideas. But then the library account has more followers than the city, and the people don't even know the city and the library are even related. Or the PD has a really, really clever social media presence, but the fire department, parks, library are completely dormant or posting just sort of very bland social media. Like, you are all one organization. You should all be saying essentially the same thing. You can say it in different ways. The departments absolutely should be empowered to create their own content, their own version of content, their own flavor of content. But if you strategically are programming that in an alignment with the overall organization, the holistic value to the taxpayer is not paying for, one charge for this, one charge for that. They're paying their taxes, and they want to see the benefit as it relates to all the things that they get for those tax dollars. And so having a strategic communications plan at the center where all departments are still participating, they're still engaged, they're still making content. They're in fact they're making more content, more fun content, and it's collaborative. The other thing that happens, I find this happens a lot in local government silos. I don't know what the heck's going on in public works. I never talk to public works. I don't know what to talk to public safety. They're all sort of off doing their own thing. Social media can be this wonderful glue that brings departments together to share the work that they're. I had no idea you were doing that. That's so awesome. I love that. That actually impacts my department in this way. That collaboration can actually be facilitated through a strategic, centralized social media plan versus having departments continuing to sort of operate in their silos. And then from the manager's perspective, look, there are certain departments that have a lot of political animals in them, right? There are people who are thinking about how they can best their department against others from a resourcing perspective or whatnot. Why are you giving them the opportunity to define that in communications, which is the purview of the city holistically? You're again, like not being on social media, like we talked about last episode, ceding power to the STPs. When you don't centralize your communication strategy, you're potentially ceding power to department heads, uh, most of whom I'm sure have good intentions, but I've certainly seen examples in my life where that's not always the case. So just keep that in mind.
I'll go one step further. You kind of stole my thunder, so I won't sound off too much on it, Sam. But there are a lot of instances where, especially in public safety, I think that's the number one spot you have to be careful if you're a city manager. You have fire chiefs and police chiefs; they're part of unions sometimes. You have to be very careful about allowing these individuals who are already highly visible in their community to have their own sort of social media presence, and whether or not those social media content is truly aligned with the best interests of the organization versus the best interests of the department. And to go one step further, whether or not the police chief or the fire chiefs is aligned with the city manager in terms of issues that could impact job security and separation and what have you. I mean, it can get really tricky. Sam, you brought up a point here that I didn't think about, but I think is a salient one that deserves expanding upon, and that is this notion that your social media or your social media department can, in many ways, act as a de facto liaison between the city manager and all these different departments, right? Because you have this touch point or multiple touch points between this individual that I think can give the city manager visibility in ways they didn't get visibility before, or by not having someone in that position.
I love that. I actually had not, until you just said it, realized that as a benefit, but it's 100% correct, right? Like the city manager has relationships with each of the departments individually, and like any human relationship, especially a relationship where it's manager to
Subordinate.
employee, right, to subordinate, that's a certain type of relationship. So you're getting a certain type of information. But I hadn't thought about it. It's a great point. If your communications lead who's talking again, not to the department heads, but to the individuals in the line positions within the departments, you're going to get filtered up to you through your one-on-ones with communications, probably information you're not even aware of because it's being discussed at the level below department head, but it's bubbling up in a way that you get pre-visibility because you have this interconnected communications team that is meeting weekly to talk about, okay, what are we creating, what's happening, what are the stories we want to tell. And oh my gosh, something's bubbling up. And so when the city manager is meeting with the comms person saying, hey, what's going on? Tell me an update. Say, hey, you should be aware of this. Like there's unrest in the public works group, right? They're frustrated about stuff. I heard that from, our member of the team. Please don't say anything. But I just want you to be aware of that. Like it's just added eyes and an added
Yeah.
process that you have control and visibility over. So again, that's a great point. I love that. I'm going to use
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I think a city manager should really kind of reimagine sort of that relationship with the social media manager, and maybe think about that in terms of getting the pulse, the touch of the pulse of the staff and what have you. And you talked about this a little bit in the book, but I think it's worth pointing out here is the engagement and interaction and communication between the line staff and a social media manager is going to be, pun intended, unfiltered to a degree that a line staff's not going to talk to a city manager. If I'm a city manager and I decide to visit a work site for some public works guys, right? Yeah, I can try to personalize it and be just one of the guys. But let's be honest, they're not going to talk to me the same way they're going to talk to another employee that's seen as just a rank and file employee or a social media. Those are more candid conversations, more unfiltered conversations that I think could behoove the city manager to be aware of.
100%. Love that. I love that point. I love when I learn something in a conversation I'm supposed to be the expert on. So great point. Really good.
Well, thank you, Sam. I want to touch on something here before we unpack this project that we are planning to unveil. And you were concluding part one of this interview, and you kind of stole my thunder a little bit. But I want to circle back and give you an opportunity to talk about it. I've been watching you for a while. In fact, what I'm going to tell you now is a conversation that sort of I initiated and broached with you and led to this project that we're going to unveil. But the big thing I wanted to ask you is, you have this social media presence. You're a social media expert. You've worked for massive companies, uh, massive influencers, or worked with them, partner. I mean, you know the space in and out. It would be so easy from where I'm looking at it. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it's not, but maybe it is, and you choose to just not do it because you have other reasons. But I look at what you're doing and I think, Sam, you're going down this route of choosing to teach people how to fish, which is it's very intensive, many man hours on your part, involves you traveling on-site visits, and it's a one-on-one type, or you one-on-one with the organization, or a singular organization. Why the hell aren't you just going the easy way and starting up your own consulting shop and selling your social media management services to all these large cities and racking up, 50,000, 100,000, $200,000 a year contracts just to go manage someone's social media presence? Like, why are you not doing that? And why are you instead doing this sort of lower financial gain benefit of one-on-one sort of consulting where you're teaching these organizations
Yep.
how to fish? And the reality is, if you go to an organization today and they hire you for your services, realistically, you don't ever have a chance of going back in that organization and teaching them for at least 5, 7, 10 years if you did your job right? Unless they have some sort of massive turnover. So can you unpack that for the audience? Like, why are you going this route versus
Yep.
the more financially lucrative consulting route, which is what everyone I would think would say, hey, that's the no-brainer option?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think it starts with my why, and it's a very personal one. Again, I've been blessed in the sense that I don't need to work. So I can sit out by my pool and have Mai Tais and just chill out, right? That was the point of retiring. I'd worked and been paid a fabulous wage and incredible bonuses and all the stock and everything you get in the private sector. And I was kind of like, yeah, I got to the point where it wasn't worth it for me to torture myself in that work environment any longer because I wasn't adding any value to society. And look, we all only get a few years, 70, 80, 90, or 100 if we're lucky years to roll around on this planet. And to me, I've always had a belief that we should leave the planet better than we found it, right? Like we should give something meaningful, something that's of value to the world that births us and nurtures us and feeds us and clothes us, etc. And so for me, that was the why. That's where it started. Like, how can I give back? And I did start like looking at volunteering, and I tried volunteering for a couple nonprofits, and I just got frustrated because there was no way to make real meaningful impact. That you can't really change those organizations because they're very slow moving, and I like to move fast, and I like to see things happen quickly, and I like to see transformation. Like my whole career, why I made as much money as I did is because I could go into an organization and transform it in a matter of a couple years and really see the product of my work. My grandmother was like, God's greatest gift is work, and I believe that. Like I'm a live to work person. I live for my work. I feel like most CAOs probably feel that way because if you don't, you're in the wrong profession, right?
Right.
Really are. But I also, from the perspective of like opportunity, there are 18,000, 19,000 municipalities in the United States, 6 or 7,000 counties. Then you add all the, boards and special agencies. I mean, there's far more work available than I could humanly service, even if I wanted to. But my goal here is to have impact in cities. It comes back to my time as a city council member, a community with 50,000 residents, very tight budgets. And I work with communities as small as 7, 8, 10,000 residents, right? Like small communities that have very limited resources to be successful. Whereas a Los Angeles, a Miami, a Denver can go ahead and spend, and by the way, I think you said like 100, 150, 200,000. From what I can tell and from what I know about those people who do this for cities, it's usually in the three to four hundred thousand
Oh my
dollars
gosh,
a
I'm in the wrong
year
business.
range. Yeah, no, it's again, I have my feelings because I know the work product that they do and it drives me crazy. But I digress. Right, like it's a yes, I could make a lot more money, but I'd basically be doing something that had very little impact that I couldn't see tangibly, like seeing a community like Collinsville, Oklahoma, or Monroeville, Pennsylvania, seeing the joy and seeing, staff members come alive while I'm there on the ground, and then hopefully watching them transform their social media is really valuable to me personally. It's worth more than the check, to be honest. So that's
Oh yeah,
the why. But I do want to find ways to scale. Like eventually just Sam cannot have the impact that Sam wants, right?
yeah.
Like
That's the curse, right? Because if you are a talented person and individual, and you want to make a difference, you do have to run this battle between scaling, right? So you can maximize your impact, but not scaling to such a degree that you sort of water down everything and you don't get that benefit, right? Or that personal
Yep.
fulfillment or what have
Yep.
you. I think that's a nice conundrum to have for sure. I knew that answer a little bit now before I asked you, because that's a little bit of a tee up one, because that was sort of I don't want to say fallout, but that was sort of a derivative conversation we had, because one day, Sam, I was thinking about you, and because we have an ongoing relationship where we communicate on a regular basis, and as I said in the first episode, I've received so much great positive feedback from other managers and peers in the space about their experience with you, or the podcast, specifically episode 67 when we did the interview. And so, I was thinking about you one day, and I decided to call you up, and I'm sure you remember this conversation. And I
I
was like,
do.
Sam, like, like you have this business model where you charge a decent amount. It's a decent sum of money to go out there, and a fair sum. I don't, to go out and train these city staffers to learn how to fish. But at the end of the day, I even might use this terminology. It's almost like a house flipper, a fixer upper. You're on that hamster wheel where, like, every time you find a house and then you fix it up and sell it, you got to jump right back on that hamster wheel and find another house to fix up, right? And that's kind of like the same model. And I said, don't you want to get like maybe like some rental properties? And it says you just got whatever, and and so
I do remember that
yeah,
conversation.
and and
Yes.
and so I was like, "Hey, I think yes, you would like to get something a little bit more consistent in a way." And I go, "Hey, there's a problem that I think that you can solve, that you're uniquely positioned to solve, and I think the American Association of Municipal Executives and Civil Social could work together on a project to sort of solve these problems and create a win-win scenario." And basically, what I proposed was these trainings that you do for the staff and teaching them how to fish. That's fantastic, but there is a big need for city managers to actually have somebody, in my opinion, come in and educate elected officials on how to handle social media, especially social media criticism, in ways that staff can be sort of unshoulder, unburdened by some of the pressures that they get from these elected officials. Because many city managers and department heads too, but obviously many city managers work in an environment where these local elected officials get all spun up and thrown into a panic if they have the same STPs, right, that are beating them over the head on social media. And I said, hey, let's come up with a program to educate these elected officials. And that's sort of what was the outcome of this whole conversation. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to unpack it a little bit more, and we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, and I want to give a big shout out to a friend of yours who I know you, like me, you keep your relationships and you guys chat, which is Richard Kaywood over in Roanoke County. Because when we were bouncing around on this, the light bulb went off because one of the things that Richard tasked me to do when we engaged with them was he's like, "Can you help me educate my electeds?" And this is the first time that question had been asked. So when you brought this up and said, "I think there's something here," I had already done a version of this for the elected body. I actually went into open session and we did a full presentation around the data of social media, the way social media can cost taxpayer money. That is a conservative, Republican led commission, and they are really interested in making sure taxpayer value is respected. So talking about really the nuts and bolts of like, this is what it's costing you as elected officials who care about, saving the taxpayer money. When you go through the process that is as it exists now, that you as the elected body have defined, unintentionally, you are creating additional burden on your residents in the form of staff time, which is actually money. And so they, in turn, were like, wow, well, what if we did it this way? And so I was like, that's a great suggestion. So they solved their own problem. But like you saw the light bulb go off in the elected officials. I know for a lot of the members of your audience, there are a lot of pain in the butt electeds. I was an elected. Thank God I was, I hope. Let me ask Charlie or Andy. I was not that much. I'm sure they had perspective and probably would never tell me. I love those guys. But like we're all a little bit, you have to be a little off if you're going to run for elected office. So I admit it. But like I think in the same way that managers have that instinctive, reflexive idea of let me protect staff, elected officials have an instinctive and reflective perspective of like, how can I be a better community leader? And
Or
understanding,
I'll go even one step further,
yeah,
right? I need to be responsive to my citizens, my
yes,
voters, the people, right?
yes,
But
yes,
there's a healthy and an unhealthy way to engage in that,
correct.
and that's what I talked about in the episode 67. If you remember, Sam, I
Yeah,
talked about how, or it might have been episode 68, I forget. But it was this idea, like, there's a lot of city managers and department head staff who have worked on a project for months and months, and they get to the finish line, and because a handful of people decide to start complaining about something on social media or at a council meeting or whatever at the finish line, all of a sudden the electeds want to call a timeout and say, well, wait a minute, we got to make sure we listen to the people and we give the communities engaged. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, that is so demoralizing of the staff. It's wasteful of so many thousands of dollars of staff time, and it just goes on and on and on.
yeah, no, 100%. And I think, look, the intention is good. And I've been to League of Cities conferences, and I've talked to elected officials in recent months. They're feeling the pain too. I know from management and from staff, the pain is real. And maybe you think, oh, the electeds aren't that engaged or they're not on social media. They don't see it the way we do. They do. They do. They're like, how do we deal with this? A lot of them are like, how do we deal with next door? It's driving me like it's painful. Right. So giving them hope, like the last episode was all about giving you hope. So I think that the idea here that brilliantly you suggested and I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to pilot a version of this. Obviously, we'll elaborate and expand on what we did in Roanoke County at Civi Social to make this brand new product. But like we know that electeds are responsive. We have a little test case there positively or willing to have that conversation. So I think this is genius. I was super excited when we just sort of riffed on it a little bit. So I think the idea, maybe Joe, you're better at. You are so much better a salesperson than I am. I'm a little bit wonky on sales, but like in the pitch, not that we're trying to sell you or sell anybody anything, but this will be a product that's available from your organization and mine in the near future. So maybe you should summarize it if I have
Yeah.
any tweaks to it. Like we're doing this in real time. This is not rehearsed, so
Yeah.
as
Well,
you
yeah,
can
it's not
tell.
it's not rehearsed, and it's not the product hasn't been finalized, but the idea was, okay, And that's why I gave the context about your business model and the thought that occurred to me and how we create a win-win, right? Because my business model essentially is, how do I create and add value for city managers? And, I'm an advocate for city managers, and time again, I see city managers get sort of bucked off the horse or the bull by, some elected officials who I think go off the deep end because of some social media comments or some rabble rousers at a council meeting. And although this is primarily focused on social media, I think obviously the tractors at the public comments are very similar in
Yeah.
this context. But
They're all
the
STPs. They
yeah,
and looking at the data holistically, even though it's around social media, we talk about like that Gallup survey and like get them the context of what that means in context of the broader group that they serve. Continue.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. No, no. So the idea was, hey, how do we create maybe a much lower priced product that can be sold more frequently, right? Because elected officials come and go every 2, 4, 6, 8 years. I mean, for most communities, right? And so the idea was, how do we one, create a product that's going to help the city managers while also helping your business get a more consistent flow of steady income, right? That's kind of like the nexus of this whole, or the intersection of these two different ideas. And so the idea essentially was, we'll put together, well, primarily you'll put together a training, whether it's 90 minutes to 3 hours or something like that. We don't know, but for a relatively modest price, in order to go down and dissect all these different issues, again, primarily on a social media landscape, for how elected officials should really process, analyze, and interpret the things that they're seeing on social media, one, and two, how to communicate that to their city manager, and three, what kind of realistic expectations they should have with respect to city manager and staff's engagement or response to those sort of inputs, right? Because at the end of the day, the selling problem, I mean, we're talking to city managers here, right? That's our entry point here for this product. And the idea is for the city manager to take the lead and purchase this training, this modestly priced training program that you're going to provide, so they can get their elected officials up to speed on how to properly communicate with them, and how to have the appropriate expectations when it comes to these social media inputs and interactions that they're seeing. I think that's it in a really simplistic nutshell. Does
Yeah,
that make
that's exactly right. And I think about, as I go back to my time as an elected official, I've, for the record, never been a city manager, but I feel like one sometimes. When I was an elected official, the first thing that happened after the swearing in was, okay, you got to go to training. You have to understand from the city attorney. These are the legal things you need to know about your position. And there are certain things you can do, and there are certain things you can't do. And here is the form of government that we are. And here's the charter. And here's how to conduct yourself and Robert's rules and all of the, I've gone into communities where they just had an election. There was a new council member that was being onboarded, and stepped in and was watching the ACM and the city manager going through that part of that process. It brought back some fond memories for me. But like, you already do this, so as members of your body come on, having this added thing where it's like, let's get them early, let's not let them get freaked out and get bad behavior started around social media for your newly electeds, and of course for your existing ones that are particularly difficult in this medium, that are giving you problems. How can we soften those edges, smooth that out, make that journey a little bit more collaborative between yourselves as the organization and your elected body? So doing that in a way that's super affordable, low lift, virtual. So for me, like Joe said, I'm traveling. I'm traveling 80% of the time, on the ground. I love what I do, but at some point, I want something a little bit more sustainable, but that has the same kind of impact that I talked about. And this seemed like a really good idea. One thing, Joe, and maybe there's a place where people can email their suggestions, things they want to see from this program, problems that they're finding with their electeds as it relates to social media, that we can contemplate as we build this. And then in the next several weeks or a couple months, we can roll out the formal program and give them like full context as to what we're talking about. But we wanted to give the audience maybe an opportunity to weigh in and share their thoughts or their needs.
Absolutely. And yeah, we can definitely do that. And, one of the things that brought this together too, this idea, and I broached it with you, is because I've stated in past episodes, right, that I used to be a former social media terrorist and an activist. And, so I know intrinsically that a lot of what happens on social media is not real in terms of being substantive, but I know it's so powerful in many ways. Excuse the expression, but I'll get off on the idea of putting, of terrorizing elected officials and getting them all spun up on an issue because you're able to get a bunch of social media comments, right? And nowadays with AI and bots, it's just a lot. It's just not
Yep.
a lot of it's astroturf. It's not real. It's not true grassroots, and so I want to be able to educate elected officials on how to properly interpret some of the criticism that you see on social media and sort of wade through the bullshit to determine whether or not this is true sentiment by the people living in your community, or is this is just a couple of people who are pushing their own agenda and like to get attention on social media because they have no other outlet for their pathetic life. So so there's that. But again, it all comes back to the idea. I love the way you articulated that a second ago because I didn't even think about that. But almost creating or adding a new tool in the toolbox for a new council member orientation, right? This idea that, hey, if you educate elected officials, duly elected officials, right when they're coming aboard on how to truly process and understand social media interaction, it could really save you, the city manager and department head staff, we're talking hours upon hours of work, right? Never mind the frustration and the demoralizing aspects of elected officials pulling the rug out from staff at the last minute because they're all spun up by social media criticism.
No, I think it's a huge gap in the marketplace. I have not heard of anything. When you said it, I was like, "This is great." And you and Mr. Kaywood both had similar thought process around this, so I love it. I think it would be very successful. I love inputs. I want to think about how to help your audience and really think about what are the challenges that they're facing, what are the common themes. Like, obviously, if you get a bunch of people coming in, there will be common themes among them. Some of you will say, I have this one council member, probably not going to be helpful, right? But it's like, if, can you please tell this one council member who always does this? No, it's not that. It's not that. But like, what are the themes that we're seeing repeated that we can literally address and walk through in this training? I'll make it fun. Everything I do is extremely engaging and interactive. They'll have plenty of time to Q&A, ask questions, both in a structured and possibly just open-ended way at the end of the session, which is why I think it'll be closer to 3 hours than 90 minutes. It might be 90 minutes of training and then engagement interaction that extends it another 90 minutes. But we've got the ingredients. And again, this is a little hat tip to Richard, who shares my passion for baking. So we're mise en placing as we speak, right? We are laying out the ingredients, but I think it would be great to have some feedback around what you'd like to see. And I cannot think of a better intersection for our two worlds, you empowering the city manager and advocating for the city manager, and my passion around transforming communications and the way we engage with this powerful and often difficult technology just felt right.
Well, I can't think of a better intersection of specialties and strengths. I mean, you have this wonderful knowledge, a subject matter expertise as being a social media expert. You have a background as a former elected official, so you get instant credibility there. Obviously, your work with me and others, and myself as a city manager and a public sector executive, we have that context, and then we have my added context of being that, yeah, former activist, right, and being and understanding that sort of world and the machinations of it. You know, a thought just hit me just a second ago when you're talking there, and it reminded me of our conversation in the episode immediately preceding this one, and that is the humanizing aspect of this training, right? So I think it's very important that the staff, city manager, department heads, the work that they do, all the time and effort and energy they put into creating a policy or program or rolling something out, for that to be humanized, for the elected officials to see it and understand all that goes into it, so that when they're sitting up there at the dais and a resident decides to come in at the very last, the 11th hour after it's been discussed for a year in multiple contexts and say, hey, we didn't know anything about this. My hope, Sam, is that we can kind of educate these elected officials and give them the backbone to be thoughtful in their
Yeah.
approach to how they respond to those residents, and say, hold on a second, because let me unpack this. The traditional model is a resident comes up and speaks, and the council wants to bend over backward to make it look like they're going to accommodate that person
Yep.
and be mindful of their concerns and to engage them right and to make them feel like they are not, that they're wrong, right? The customer's always right. It would be nice if we could get elected officials trained up to the point where they could say, well, wait a minute, Mr. or Mrs. Smith, this is very disrespectful to the staff who have been working on this for a year plus, and we've had these three different public scoping sessions, and we've had a half dozen conversations at previous council meetings, and yet you didn't speak on that then, and nobody spoke on that then. I
Yep.
think that's what we got to get our elected officials to a degree. We are in a participative democracy, right? A Republican democracy, where you as a resident don't just get to come in at the 11th hour and throw a monkey wrench in the process because you just quote unquote found out about it now.
Yeah, I'm going to make it even simpler because the best words a elected official could say in that circumstance is "Thank you. We'll take it under advisement," and then
There you
move the
go.
heck on. And the reason this is interesting, and this is where the intersection of Civi Social and this new product comes in, right? What I want is for the electeds to understand the underbelly, not the negative underbelly, but like how social media works, so that if you have a communications team that's working closely with their manager, that they can say something like, "Thank you, we'll take it under advisement." And that could be genuine. They might actually want to take it under advisement. But the next conversation is, here's the analytics. Like, we've done this for a year. Here's the share ratio on TikTok. Here's what people have said about it. Here's the sentiment. Talking in the language of analytics and saying, like, when we think about the community as a whole, we know there's support. So yes, there's an individual who posted something on Facebook or came to council, but you can have confidence that that person does not represent or reflect the actual will of people, and you can make that vote with that confidence without being worried that behind that person at the microphone, there's 100 or 500 or 1,000 more that feel that way. It's just it's an STP. And if we can make them understand that the STPs, we have to respect them, we have to appreciate that this is democracy and we all have our voice and we all should be respected, but it is a representative democracy, meaning that the majority, and in most cases it's a large majority, that's 67% of folks that trust local government, want that thing to happen, trust their local government, both their electeds and the staff that's managing it, to make that happen on their behalf. And when we can measure it and we can talk about it in, unemotional terms, and when they see that social media is a technology and there are ways to measure that technology, and that they're educated in that, they understand the context of one comment in the pool of 5 billion posts a day, that's power. That's why this, I think, makes so much sense.
Amen. Really, when you think about it, the elected officials' response is one of fear to and uncertainty, right? They're afraid that that one person's comment or those couple of comments are somehow representative of a larger mass of people, right? And ultimately, it's fear of not being liked, not being reelected, not being approved by by the people. So if you can educate those electeds and explain to them how to measure the authenticity, right? Pun intended, of going back to that first episode, right? We talk about authenticity, right? If you can measure the authenticity of those comments and whether or not they're valid or representative of the community as a whole, then I think you can educate those elected officials and give them the backbone and the courage to say, no, our staff has gone through this process. We support our staff. We're going to back our staff. It's
Yeah.
important that we do so. You've had these opportunities to weigh in and communicate your
Yep.
opinions, and we're moving forward.
A hundred
So
percent. And if your communications team is trained in analytics and builds those dashboards and understands, and you can ask them, like, what are people saying? What is the thought on this? How do we make content to measure or get understanding of this thought? And again, these things, like you said, they're taking time, many weeks, many months, many years to bring to the final vote. You have plenty of time to get that data, to test using content, to leverage the power that is social media, to get that perspective. And so in that packet with the council members, not only is the recommendation, but here's the social media data. Here's what people are saying. Here's how they feel. This is why you should have confidence. So, yeah, when that crank comes up to the microphone and says, "I think this is terrible, and I represent everybody in this community, and we all feel the same way," you could say, "We thank you very much. We'll take that under advisement with great confidence, and you know how you're going to vote."
That's such a great point, Sam, because there are a lot of things that city managers and department heads can do to preemptively counter those sort of rug pullers, right? Those STPs, if they're going to give more detailed information in, say, the agenda reports or memos that are being sent up to the elected officials about these projects. So I think that's a very, very good point that you make there.
And I got a tip for your audience, which is something I recently discovered. Did I ever tell you about Notebook LM?
I'm not sure. I don't think
Okay,
so.
so this is a new AI product from Google. I think it is absolutely genius. It is a summary AI, which means you can put any document, you can put the entire council agenda into this program called Notebook LM and ask it to create an audio summary. And what it does is it creates a podcast. Joe, it might put you out of business because it's pretty darn good, right? But it's so fascinating because you can put the document in, it will make a podcast of that document of two people bantering, kind of like we are right now. But you can also, when you prompt it, give it, your perspective as city manager to have it go in the direction you'd like council to move. And so on their way to council meeting, they got a 15, 20-minute podcast they can listen to, which will literally walk them through the agenda with your perspective. They don't even need to read the binders, right? So you can use technology constantly to make your life and make your job easier. Um, just a little tip for your listeners in case they want to play around with AI.
Fascinating, fascinating. So, Sam, do we have any thoughts on the timeline for rolling something like this out? What do you think we're looking at here?
So I think the best time to launch this would be in November. We know we're going to have elections. It'll give us time, Joe, get some feedback from your audience. You and I can play with this. I think it would be great as these new people are coming on to council to be able to bring them this training as a part of their initial onboarding. We'll be doing it, obviously, if it's successful, probably on a monthly basis. So, we know elections are happening. There were elections in Texas this month. There's always local elections. So we will have it on a regular cadence, but I think November is a good timeline. And the other thing I was thinking is, maybe we do a test bed where, we invite city managers who are interested in it to come and see what the training looks like so that before they put their new council member in front of a stranger who's going to talk to them about social media for 3 hours, that they get a flavor for what we're going to be talking about. They can provide us additional feedback. We can tighten it up. And you've clearly talked to some of my clients. I am a perfectionist when it comes to this. I want everything that I do and I put my name on to be absolutely the best product that exists in the world. And so this will be that. And so I think November is the perfect timeline to give us the time to make it perfect.
That's great to hear, but I am going to crack the whip. I'm going to do my best, folks, to try to get Sam to put it out sooner than November. We'll see. I know this is a very important, valuable product that could be very useful to all the city managers out there. And frankly, we're talking about a product that's very important to electeds. I mean, we want elected officials to be more comfortable in their skin as elected officials, to feel more competent about the decisions they make. And we want elected officials to not behave in a capricious, whimsical manner. And so we think this is a very important product, not only for them, but for better local government as a whole. Sam, you talked about in the first episode about the favorability rating of local government being very high. And I think this is one way we can keep it elevated. And that's by having a solid relationship of trust built between the elected officials and the city managers. And I think having that, navigating that complex social media dynamic, and having both the city manager and the elected officials understand both respective parties when it comes to how they're looking and viewing social media, I think could be a very valuable thing in this equation. And so that's why I'm really excited about unveiling this product in the very near future.
Yes. Well, if you crack the whip, I'd be thrilled to do it earlier. But, like Walt Disney, who we talked about a lot in the last episode, Walt Disney was a perfectionist. I share that trait. So just know that whenever, if it's October, if it's September, whenever we put it out, it will be tested, tried, true, and awesome. And your elected officials will love it. I promise you that.
Thank you very much, Sam. Sam Toles, he is the author of the new book, The Social Media Playbook for City and County Managers. It is on Amazon, but I will also have a link where Sam is graciously offered to send it for free to the City Manager Unfiltered listeners. I mean, what a deal. Nothing beats free. And I'll put that link in the show notes. Thank you once again, Sam. I'm Joe Turner. This is City Manager Unfiltered, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast because I put content like this out there. If you've enjoyed the program, please make sure you hit that follow, subscribe button on your platform of choice. And if you've not left a rating or review on your platform of choice, especially Spotify and Apple, I would appreciate if you did so today. Catch you next week.